The Sandstorm was already swallowing Hollow Creek Farm when Morvella Vaughan heard desperate screams cutting through the wind. 3 human cowboys emerged from the dust, nearly dead, starving, and too weak to keep going. And even though she was an orc widow rejected by Red Hollow, she used the last food left on the farm to save them, never imagining that 2 days later a long line of riders would appear at her door. The Sandstorm swallowed the horizon whole. One moment there were flat plains stretching toward Red Hollow's distant silhouette. The next, a wall of brown darkness rose from the earth like something alive, like something angry, rolling forward with a sound that shook the bones before it touched the skin. Morvella Vaughan stood on the porch of Hollow Creek Farm and watched it come. She didn't run. She didn't call out or grab tools or rush to secure the shutters with any real urgency. She just stood there, green hands resting on the rotting railing, and watched the world disappear behind a curtain of dust and rage. She had stopped fearing storms a long time ago. There was nothing left in her worth protecting from them. The old farm trembled as the first wave of wind hit. The barn door banged open and slammed shut in rapid percussion. Dry soil lifted from the fields Thomas had once tended with such stubborn care, spinning into columns before vanishing upward. The chickens screamed from inside their coop. The mule kicked at her stall walls. Morvella turned slowly and moved through the chaos the way old rivers move, without rushing, without stopping, without any particular feeling about the direction. She checked the latch on the hen coop. She dropped the crossbar on the barn door. She dragged a feed sack against the gap under the back door of the farmhouse. Each task was performed with the mechanical precision of someone who had long since lost the ability to care whether any of it mattered. Since Thomas died, she had simply continued existing. That was the honest word for it. Not living, not surviving with hope attached. Just existing. Moving through the motions of a farm she no longer knew how to leave and no longer knew how to love. Red Hollow had made that very clear. They hadn't needed to shout it. Nobody in Red Hollow ever shouted at Morvella directly. They just stopped looking at her, stopped answering when she spoke at the general store, left gaps around her at the market that were somehow more painful than any insult. Thomas had been the bridge between her and that town. When he died trying to pull the horses from a flooding gully in the middle of a night storm 3 years ago, the bridge burned with him. Now there was just this: the farm, the wind, the pointed ears that marked her as wrong in every room she entered, the small presses at the corners of her mouth, barely visible when she pressed her lips together, had grown into something she tried to hide in photographs, back when there had been photographs, back when Thomas had smiled beside her in them. She was wiping dust from the kitchen window when she heard it. A voice. No. Voices. Plural. Ragged and desperate, torn apart by the storm before they could fully form. She pressed her face to the glass and saw nothing but brown, swirling darkness. Then shapes appeared. 3 of them. Human shapes staggering forward through the wall of sand, moving the way men move when they have already decided they are dying but haven't completely stopped trying. Their horses were gone or lost. Their hats were gone too. They moved with arms raised against the gale, heads down, lurching forward on legs that had forgotten how to be certain. Morvella stood very still. Every reasonable thought in her told her to stay inside. Men from the plains did not come to orc widows for shelter, not with kindness, not without wanting something they had no right to want. But they were going to fall before they reached her door. She could see it in the way the tallest one's knees buckled with each gust. She pushed the door open against the wind, braced herself in the frame, and called out into the storm loud enough to be heard. Her voice was deeper than most women's. Strong even when the rest of her wasn't. "Here!" she called. "Over here! Move toward my voice!" The figures turned. They came through her door like broken things. The first man, tall, broad, with a face so covered in reddish dust that his eyes looked like pale stones in brown mud, grabbed the doorframe and nearly pulled it off its hinges, getting inside. The second stumbled against him, and both of them crashed into the entry together, breathing in great ragged pulls as the storm screamed behind them. The third man came last. He was different from the others immediately. Not in the way he was dressed, though his coat was darker and more worn. Not in the way he moved, though he moved more quietly, even half dead from the storm. It was something in his eyes when he stepped through the door and straightened up. He looked at the room, then at her, then at the room again. Not with hostility, not with relief either, just with the flat, steady attention of someone who was always calculating exits. Morvella closed the door behind him and threw the bar down. The silence inside was not really silence. The storm outside made the walls groan and the floor tremble, but compared to the chaos beyond those boards, the kitchen felt like the bottom of a deep, still lake. "Sit," she said, not unkindly, "before you fall." The tall man, who would later say his name was Cole, dropped into a chair with the total commitment of someone who had been holding themselves upright through pure willpower and was now releasing it all at once. The second man, younger, with a split lip bleeding through the dust on his face, sat more carefully against the wall near the door. The third man stood near the fireplace and said nothing. Cole looked up at Morvella with eyes that had immediately done the calculation. Orc, female, alone, and then visibly reminded himself that he was inside and warm, and that whatever this was, it was better than what was happening out there. "Ma'am," he said, "we don't want trouble." "I didn't open the door for trouble," Morvella said. "I opened it because you were going to die." He nodded like that was a reasonable sentence. She moved to the small stove in the corner. The fire inside had been banked low, barely surviving the drafts that pushed through every crack in the walls. She built it back up with the focused economy of someone who had learned that warmth was not something to be taken for granted. While she worked, she heard the younger man exhale slowly, heard the creak of Cole shifting his weight in the chair, heard nothing from the third man. She glanced back once. He was still standing, still watching, not watching her specifically, watching the room, the door, the window with its shutter rattling against the storm. His coat hung from shoulders that were wide and square, and held carefully even now, even exhausted. A scar ran from below his left cheekbone down toward his jaw, old, clean-healed, but deep once. Morvella looked away. She had almost nothing left in the pantry. She knew that without checking, because she had known for 3 days and been deciding what to do about it. Half a sack of flour, some dried beans, coffee grounds that had already been used twice, a heel of cured pork wrapped in cloth that was meant to last her another week. She unwrapped it without hesitating. She broke the pork into the pot with the beans and started the coffee going on the edge of the grate. Bread was possible. Barely. She worked the dough by feel in the low firelight while the storm pushed and howled outside, and the 2 talking men started to come back to themselves in slow, stuttering sentences. The third man still hadn't sat down. He was going to be trouble in some way she couldn't name yet. She kept her hands moving and tried not to think about it. The bread came out dense and dark, the way bread always did, when the flour was old and the hands pressing it were tired. Morvella set it on the table with the pot of beans and poured 3 cups of coffee that were more hot water than anything else. Cole and the younger man, who said his name was Denny, barely 19 by the sound of his voice, fell on the food with the direct honesty of people who had stopped pretending not to be hungry. They ate quickly and with focus, which Morvella respected more than politeness would have looked in that moment. The third man finally moved. He crossed the room and took a cup of coffee from the table without sitting down. He stood slightly apart from the others, near the fireplace, and held the cup in both hands and drank from it slowly with his eyes on the low flames. He had not given his name. Morvella watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. There was something heavy living in him. Not recent heavy, not the weight of a bad week or a hard season, the kind of heavy that had settled into the joints over years and made every movement slightly more deliberate than it needed to be. She recognized it because she moved the same way. had moved that way since the night a deputy had knocked on her door in the rain and told her that Thomas wasn't coming home. Cole thanked her twice. Denny thanked her with eyes that kept going to her ears and then away again, embarrassed about the looking, which she found almost sweet. The third man said nothing. After the meal, Cole and Denny moved their chairs closer to the fire and were unconscious within 20 minutes, the way men who have been truly cold and truly afraid go unconscious, completely, like extinguished lanterns. The third man remained awake. He was sitting now, finally, in the wooden chair farthest from the fire. Not because he didn't want warmth, she got the sense he was simply accustomed to giving the better positions to other people without being asked. His boots were crossed at the ankle. The cup was empty in his hands. His eyes were still on the fire, but had gone somewhere else entirely. Morvella brought her own chair to the edge of the firelight and sat. They didn't speak for a long time. Outside, the storm did not relent. It shook the window panes and came in under the door as a thin, brown line of dust that spread slowly across the floorboards. The old house groaned with each gust, like an animal in pain. Finally, because silence felt more intimate than speaking, and she needed one of them to break it, Morvella said quietly, "There's a blanket on the shelf behind you." He turned his head, found the shelf, looked back at her. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was low and rough-edged, like gravel shifting under a boot heel. "You're cold," she said. Not an argument, just an observation. Another pause. Then he reached back without getting up and pulled the blanket down from the shelf. He settled it across his shoulders with a small, single nod in her direction that was the most compressed expression of gratitude she had ever witnessed. She found herself almost wanting to smile. She didn't, but the impulse was there, surprising her, small as a candle flame in the bottom of a very large, dark room. His name, she would find out later that night, after Cole and Denny had been snoring for an hour, and she had been staring at the ceiling of her bedroom listening to the storm, was Garrick. He had offered it the way a man surrenders something he isn't certain he wants to give. "Just the one word," said quietly when she'd asked. She lay in bed that night and turned it over in her mind. Garrick. Something about the night felt different. She couldn't explain it. She had not invited it. But different was what it was, and she fell asleep, holding it, like something fragile. Morning arrived without apology. The storm had passed somewhere in the early hours and left behind a landscape so changed it seemed almost rude. Hollow Creek Farm had become an island in a sea of brown. Sand dunes where the vegetable rows had been, red dust packed against every vertical surface, fence posts buried to half their height in pale orange mounds that the night wind had sculpted into something almost beautiful if you could forget what they'd destroyed. Morvella stood on the porch with her first cup of real coffee, her last grounds, no question about it, and surveyed the damage with the practiced eye of someone who had been assessing losses long enough to do it without crying. The south fence was gone. The garden was gone. 2 sections of roof had peeled back on the barn, and the chicken coop door had finally given up the fight and lay flat in the yard, the hinge torn from the wood like a pulled tooth. She heard the door behind her and knew without turning that it wasn't Cole or Denny. Their horses were gone from the post. 2 sets of tracks in the fresh drift of sand led east, away from the farm, already half-filled by the morning breeze. They had left before dawn. On the table inside, under a cracked cup, she found 3 coins, not much, but not nothing, and left with intention. Garrick stood beside her on the porch. He looked at the damage, the same way she did. Not with horror or pity, just with the level, calculating attention of someone deciding how long it would take to fix. "Roads'll be bad," he said. "They will," she agreed. He stood there another moment, then went down the porch steps and started walking toward the fallen barn roof section without being asked. Morvella watched him pick up a piece of warped timber, test its weight, set it aside. "Pick up another." She went inside and made breakfast from almost nothing, When she brought him a plate, he took it without ceremony and ate, standing up near the barn, still looking at the damage as he chewed. She stood a few feet away, and they ate together in the early light, with the ruined landscape spread out before them, and the sky an impossible clean blue above it all, the way skies always were after storms, as if they were trying to apologize. "You don't have to stay," she said. "Roads are bad," he said again, and that was that. He spent the morning on the barn roof with tools from Thomas's old chest that he found without being directed. Morvella worked the south fence, dragging posts from under the drifts with her hands, because the orc blood in her at least gave her that, strength enough to do alone what a human woman would have needed 2 men for. She was grateful for it in the same way she was grateful for her size and her endurance, quietly, privately, in ways she never mentioned aloud, because the same things that made her useful also made her wrong to the people in Red Hollow. In the afternoon, they rested on the porch without speaking and drank water from the cistern. In the evening, she made beans again, and he built up the fire. They sat on opposite sides of it after supper, and eventually, Morvella began to speak, slowly, the way frozen ground thaws, reluctantly and then all at once. She told him about Thomas, not everything, not yet, just the shape of him, the stubborn kindness, the way he had never once looked at her ears or her hands with anything except the same warm, distracted attention he gave everything he loved. Garrick listened without filling the pauses. When she finished, the fire had burned low. "People always need someone to blame," he said quietly. "Makes the hurting feel like it has a reason." The words landed somewhere behind her sternum and stayed there. She looked at him across the coals. He was looking at the fire again, but there was something in the set of his jaw, a held tightness, that told her he wasn't talking only about other people. He stayed 4 more days. Morvella told herself it was practical. The roads genuinely were bad. A man on horseback heading east would be riding through saddle-deep drifts for the better part of a day before the trail cleared. She told herself this every morning when she woke to the sound of him already moving outside, already pulling boards or lifting stones or restringing fence wire with the quiet, steady focus of someone for whom work was also thinking. She told herself practical things, and then she watched him from the kitchen window and felt the small, inconvenient truth of the matter pressing against the inside of her chest, like something trying to get out. On the second evening, she told him more about Thomas's death, the flooding gully, the horses trapped, the night too dark for anyone to have seen clearly, which was the only mercy in it. The way the deputy's hat had been wet from the rain when he'd stood at her door, and how she'd known before he'd said a word because there was no other reason for a deputy to come to an orc widow's farm in the middle of the night. She told him about coming to the church 2 weeks later, thinking community might be some comfort, and the way the pew beside her had stayed empty even when the building was full. Garrick's expression didn't change, but he went still in a particular way. Not the stillness of a man who doesn't care, but the stillness of a man who is listening with his entire body. "They blamed you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Some of them," she said. "Most of them eventually, not out loud, just the way people find ways to make it someone's fault. Because it's easier. Because I was there and Thomas wasn't anymore." He nodded once. Then he said quietly, "I know what it is to be made into the reason." She waited. He didn't say more, not that night, but the words sat between them like an open door, and Morvella understood that he was offering something real, the edge of something he did not offer easily, and she did not push. On the third day, she found herself laughing at something. A genuine laugh, surprised out of her by the mule's particular expression of outrage when Garrick tried to lead her to fresh water. She covered her mouth immediately after, as if embarrassed by the sound, as if it was something shameful. Garrick looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "When did you stop doing that?" he asked. "Doing what?" "Laughing." She thought about it honestly. 3 years ago. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the mule and resumed the argument with the animal as if the conversation had not happened. But something had shifted. The fourth evening, they sat on the porch watching the last orange line of sunset dissolve behind the dust on the horizon. The night was warm in the way frontier nights sometimes were. Not comfortable exactly, but alive with crickets and the distant call of something moving through the brush. "You're going tomorrow," she said. It wasn't a question. "Roads should be clear," he said. "I know." A pause. "You'll manage," he said. "I always manage." She said it without bitterness, because it was simply true, and she was tired of performing bitterness about things that were simply true. In the morning, he was gone before she reached the kitchen. The porch was empty, the road was empty, and Hollow Creek Farm was as quiet as a held breath that didn't know how to release itself. She stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the place where the road curved east and disappeared. Then she went inside and started her day. His absence had weight. 3 days passed, then 4. That was the thing that caught her off guard. Not the silence which she was used to, and not the extra work which she had always done alone. It was the specific gravity of him not being there, the particular shape of the empty porch chair, the fire that she built each evening and sat beside without anyone to sit across from. She worked harder to compensate, rose before the sun, went to bed after it, pushed her body into the long physical labor of rebuilding the farm's damaged sections with a ferocity that was partly productive and partly just filling the hours before they could fill themselves with thinking. She fixed the chicken coop door herself, rebuilt 2 sections of south fence, patched the barn roof with salvaged boards and a jar of black pitch that she found in the back of the tool shed. On the 4th evening after Garrick left, she sat down to supper alone at the table and found herself looking at the empty chair across from her for a full minute before she started eating. She was not a foolish woman. She knew what this was. She had been alone for 3 years, and she had grown, if not comfortable with it, at least armored against it. A few days of quiet presence should not have undone 3 years of careful hardening. And yet. She washed the plate, dried it, set it on the shelf, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark fields. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The old house clicked and settled around her. She heard hooves. Her head came up fast. Her pulse jumped in a way that embarrassed her even alone in her own kitchen. She told herself it was nothing, a traveller on the North Road or the mule getting restless, and then told herself to stop being ridiculous and go to bed. But she went to the porch first. The road was empty under a thick scatter of stars. She stood there longer than she should have, long enough to feel foolish, and then went inside. She thought about him differently after that. With a certain honesty she hadn't allowed herself while he was present. The way he listened, fully, without interruption, without the particular kind of half-listening that was really just waiting for your turn to speak. The steadiness of him, the way he had never once looked at her ears or her hands with the complicated expression she had come to expect from every human face. He had looked at her the way Thomas used to look at her, like a person. She sat by the cold fireplace for a long time and let herself feel that completely, because she had learned the hard way that denying what was true didn't make it go away. It just made it heavier. Outside, the plains lay vast and dark and indifferent. And then, 3 days later, she was at the kitchen window again when the sound came back. Real this time. She knew immediately, not the random rhythm of a single traveller, but the gathering percussion of many hooves, a sound that seemed to press against the bottom of her feet through the floorboards before it reached her ears. She stepped onto the porch. The horizon was moving. A line of figures emerged from the dust, 10, then 15, then more, riding in a loose formation with gear loaded heavy on the saddles, coming directly toward Hollow Creek Farm. Movella's blood went cold. She went inside and came back with Thomas's shotgun. Her hands were shaking. She made herself hold steady. The riders came closer through the amber late afternoon light, and the dust parted. and she saw the man at the front of the column, the set of those shoulders, the particular way he sat a horse like he was part of it rather than on top of it. She lowered the gun before she fully knew she was doing it. Garrick. He hadn't come back empty-handed. Behind him rode 15 men with saddles loaded heavy, lumber strapped to pack horses, barrels of water, sacks of grain and flour and dried goods, coils of new fence wire, boxes of nails, glass jars, cured meat, seeds. A supply run that would have cost more than Morvella had seen in a single place in 3 years. They dismounted with quiet efficiency, no speeches, no ceremony. They simply looked at the farm, assessed what needed doing, and began. Morvella stood in the yard and watched it happen around her. A barrel-chested man with grey-streaked hair immediately climbed to the barn roof with better lumber than she'd used for her patch. 2 younger men started pulling damaged fence posts from the south line, stacking them for burning and driving fresh ones with heavy mallets that rang across the flats like slow bells. Another disappeared into the kitchen and came out a few minutes later with an appraising look directed at the chimney, which had needed repointing for 2 years. Garrick walked toward her through all of it. He handed her a 50-pound sack of flour without preamble, just lifted it from a pack horse and carried it to her like it was a perfectly natural thing. "Why?" she managed. "Storm took things from you," he said. "We're giving them back." She looked at the sack of flour in her arms. She looked at the men working across her property. She looked at him. "You told them," she said. "I told them what you did," he said. "They decided the rest on their own." Ndi. There was a quality to that sentence, the way he gave the credit away completely, that landed somewhere she hadn't expected. She carried the flour inside before her expression could say too much. From the kitchen window, she watched the work progress with a surreal clarity, the kind of seeing that happens when something so contrary to your expectations unfolds that your brain has to update its entire model of the world in real time. Red Hollow had watched her struggle for 3 years, had watched the farm deteriorate and the fence lines sag and the garden shrink, had watched a widow doing the work of 3 people with the tools of 1, and had decided that her difficulties were her own problem, an orc's problem, a consequence of existing in a space where she wasn't entirely welcome. These men had known her for 4 days. 4 days and 1 shared meal in a storm, and they came back with lumber. She made coffee for everyone and brought it out in whatever vessels she had, cups and tin mugs and a ceramic pot she carried from table to table refilling. The men took it with nods and quiet thanks. The work did not stop. At the edge of the property, where the south fence was being rebuilt post by post, she noticed 2 figures standing at the property line watching. She recognized them both. Miriam Pike and her husband Aldrin, the pastor, standing side by side with their arms folded. Aldrin's expression was the particular shade of disapproving that meant he was already composing the version of this he would tell at Sunday's service. Miriam stood slightly behind him, watching the men work with something in her face that was trying to be concern, and was instead the shape of concern, covering something older and less charitable. Morvella met their eyes from across the yard and did not look away. They turned and walked back toward town without speaking. That evening, the men built a fire in the yard and ate together from the supplies they'd brought. Someone produced a harmonica and played it badly and cheerfully, and another man told a story about a horse and a river crossing that made the others laugh at the ending. Morvella sat at the edge of the fire. Garrick sat beside her. Not across from her, beside her. Close enough that the warmth of him was distinct from the warmth of the fire. "They'll talk," she said quietly, meaning Red Hollow. "People always talk," he said. "They'll say things. About me. About you being here." He was quiet for a moment. "Then does it change what's true?" She looked at the fire. "No," she said. "Then let them talk." The men stayed 2 nights. On the second morning they packed their gear and left one by one at dawn, each nodding to Morvella with a respect that felt earned rather than performed. The yard went quiet again. The new fence posts stood pale and straight in the morning light. The barn roof held. Garrick was the last to remain. Miriam Pike arrived alone the following morning. She came on foot, which meant she had walked the mile from town with deliberate intent, which meant the visit was not spontaneous, which meant the visit was a message. She had watched everything from the property line the day before, the men, the supplies, the work, Morvella moving among them, and had clearly spent the night deciding what to do about it. She stood at the edge of the yard in her good grey dress, with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression arranged into something that was trying to be concern, and was instead exactly what Morvella had seen on her face from across the yard yesterday. Morvella came off the porch to meet her. "Mrs. Vaughan," Miriam said, "I wanted to come speak with you personally, after everything we saw yesterday." "Then speak," Morvella said. "My husband was very troubled by what he saw. All those men here, men none of us know." A pause, the specific pause that contains an entire judgment. An orc woman, alone here, receiving that many armed strangers on her property. You understand how it looks to the community. The word looks landed carefully, surgically. "I understand how it looks to some people," Morvella said. "Aldrin is concerned. The whole congregation is concerned." A breath. "We all feel that perhaps you've strayed somewhat from the path of propriety. For your own sake, Morvella, we say this for your sake." The "for your sake" was the part that finally broke something loose in Morvella's chest. "Where were you?" she said quietly. "When Thomas died?" Miriam blinked. "Where was the community's concern then?" Morvella continued, her voice still level, still controlled, because she had learned that anger was only powerful when it was cold. "I came to church for 2 months after and sat alone in the pew because no one would sit beside me. I asked Warren Croft if he might spare 2 fence posts, 2 posts, and he told me he didn't have any, and I watched him sell a full load to Hector Reed 3 days later. I have managed this farm alone for 3 years. 3 years with no help from Red Hollow, no concern, no propriety either way." She stopped. "And now some men who owe me a kindness came and gave it back," she said. "And that is what concerns you." Miriam was very still. "The gods see further than Red Hollow's fences," Morvella said. "I know what I've done and what I haven't. I don't need you to measure it for me." Miriam left without the speech she'd come prepared to give. Morvella stood in the yard after her and let her pulse slow. When she turned, Garrick was on the porch. She hadn't heard him come out. He was leaning against the post with his arms crossed, watching her with that flat, steady look. She walked up the steps. "I heard most of it," he said. "I know." They stood beside each other, looking at the road where Miriam had gone. "Her husband was already there yesterday," Garrick said quietly. "He saw everything himself. The town will send someone more serious next time." "I know that too," Morvella said. She looked at him then, directly. "I'm not afraid of them," she said. It was more true than it had ever been. The days after that found a rhythm that included Garrick without ceremony. He worked, she worked. They ate together and talked sometimes, and were silent together more often. And the silence was the good kind, the kind that means 2 people have stopped performing ease and found the real thing underneath. But Morvella saw how Garrick sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and looked south toward the far hills, with eyes that were somewhere else entirely. She saw the way he catalogued sounds before she did, footsteps, hoofbeats, voices, with a reflex too practiced to be anything but old fear. One evening she simply asked. He told her about Blackwater Ridge, a fire, a man dead in it, him in the wrong place, the only wrong place, and at the wrong time, and a town that needed an answer, and had chosen him for it before the smoke cleared. He had not waited for a trial, because a trial in Blackwater Ridge for a man without money and without connections was not a process. It was a ceremony with a predetermined ending. "Do you regret running?" she asked. "Every day," he said, "because it meant leaving people I should have stayed for." She looked at his hands resting on his knees in the firelight. "You stayed here," she said. He met her eyes. "I know," he said. 3 days later, a boy came running down the south road toward the farm. He couldn't have been older than 12, breathless and wide-eyed, skidding to a stop at the edge of the yard with his hat in his hands. "Miss Vaughan," he said between gasps. "Men are coming, with ropes and lanterns. My pa sent me to warn you, said there's more than a dozen of them, and Pastor Pike is leading." Morvella looked at Garrick. Garrick was already moving, quiet and deliberate, back toward the house. There were 16 of them. Morvella counted from the porch, her hand on the post, the old shotgun leaning inside the door because she had it and wasn't reaching for it yet. 16 horses moving in a column down the south road in the grey early light, and Pastor Aldrin Pike at the front of them with a coil of rope draped over his saddle horn, like he'd spent the morning deciding whether to bring it, and decided yes. Garrick stood beside her. He had heard them before she had, and come out already dressed, his coat buttoned, his hands loose at his sides. They waited together. The column stopped at the edge of the yard. Pike pulled up his horse and looked down from the saddle at Morvella with the expression of a man who had convinced himself that what he was doing was righteous, which was the most dangerous kind of expression a man could wear. "Mrs. Vaughan," he said, "we've come for the fugitive." "You've come to my property," Morvella said. "The man standing beside you is wanted for murder in Blackwater Ridge. You are harboring a criminal. You need to step aside." The men behind him shifted. Warren Croft was there. The deputy was there. A dozen others she recognized from years of being ignored by them in various doorways and market stalls across Red Hollow. Morvella felt the old familiar contraction in her chest, the learned reflex of an orc woman surrounded by humans who had decided something about her. And then she felt something else move through her, something newer and steadier, something that had been building for weeks in the quiet of the farm. She thought of Thomas. She thought of him the way she sometimes did in moments that required courage, not as a wound, but as a compass. "This man came to my door half dead in a storm," she said. "I fed him. He came back and helped rebuild what the storm took. He has worked this land and done no harm to anyone here, and I will not hand him to you." Pike's jaw tightened. "You are an orc woman without standing in this community." "I am a woman on her own land," Morvella said. Her voice didn't rise. It simply did not retreat. "And you will have to pass both of us to take anyone from it." The silence that followed had texture to it. She could feel it pressing against the morning. Garrick stepped forward slightly, not in front of her, but beside her. The specific alignment of beside, which was different from in front, which was different from behind. It meant something. The men on horses looked at each other. Warren Croft looked at his horse's mane. The deputy looked at Pike. Pike looked at Morvella with something shifting behind his eyes. Not regret, not quite, but the early trembling of a certainty that was discovering it had less foundation than it had felt this morning when he was saddling his horse. One by one, something went out of them, not all at once. Slowly, the way a fire goes out when no one is tending it, one ember, then another, then the slow darkening of the whole. 3 men at the back turned their horses first, then 2 more, then Croft, without meeting anyone's eyes. The deputy was last, and he looked at Morvella one final time, and she held his gaze without apology, and then he turned too. Pike remained another moment. He looked at the farm, at the new fence posts, the patched barn roof, the repaired porch steps, and whatever he was going to say next, he didn't say it. He turned his horse and rode. The road was empty. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now, lighter, cleaned of something. Morvella let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 years. Garrick turned to look at her. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it, not smiling, not relieved exactly, but present in a way that he usually kept guarded, the way a man looks when he has stopped protecting himself for a moment, because he has decided it is finally safe. She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Neither did you," she said. "The first time, or the second, or any of it." He was quiet. "Stay," she said. Not a demand, not a plea, just the simple, honest word for what she meant. The morning light spread slowly across the plains behind him, gold and clean, catching the dust still settling from the horse's departure, and turning it briefly to something that looked, if you chose to see it that way, like light. He nodded. Morvella turned and looked out at the farm, the fields that needed planting, the fence lines restored, the chickens moving in their coop, the mule looking over her stall wall with customary suspicion toward the world, the place where Thomas had lived and died and loved her, the place that was hers. She put her hand on the porch railing and felt the old wood solid beneath her fingers and listened to the plains breathe all around her and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that the word home and the word alive were pointing at the same direction. Behind her, she heard Garrick step inside. She stayed on the porch a little longer. The spring air moved across the flat land and lifted the hair at her temples and smelled like soil and distance and something faintly green. Small things were growing in the dark. She had known that before, but knowing it now felt entirely different. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.